Chapter 3. Almost 20 years ago, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that mob bosses Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante had the motive and means to kill JFK, but the committee was unable to figure out how they did it, since crucial evidence was withheld from them, especially regarding the JFK Alameda coup plan. Based on conclusive evidence and testimonies that have come to light in recent years, it's now clear that Marcello and Trafficante worked together with Mafia Don Johnny Rosselli to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. All three confessed their involvement to trusted associates shortly before their deaths, including stunning admissions in FBI files detailed here for the first time. It was the JFK Alameda coup plan that gave the Mafia chiefs the opportunity they needed to kill JFK in such a way that any true investigation would compromise the coup plan, exposing Commander Almeida and triggering a confrontation with the Soviets in Cuba. The committee was also denied important evidence about Johnny Roselli, one of the small groups of U.S. intelligence assets who helped the Mafia infiltrate the coup plan and use parts of it to kill JFK. Marcello, Trafficante, and Roselli had all faced an unprecedented and escalating onslaught throughout JFK's admission. Bobby's intense pressure on the Mafia in general, and those three mob bosses in particular, was at its peak by November 1963. The Mafia had been exposed on television in millions of homes in September 1963 by sensational Senate crime hearings in which the star witness, Joe Valachi, became the first member of the Mafia to publicly reveal its secrets. Carlos Marcello controlled Louisiana and much of Texas, but November 1963 found him on trial in federal court in New Orleans by Bobby's own prosecutors and facing permanent deportation. In Texas, Marcello and Traficante's portion of the French Connection heroin network had recently faced a major bust for the second time in a year. All of Santo Traficante's operations in Florida, from drugs to gambling, were under attack, and even his own brothers had been arrested and indicted. Traficante himself had been the subject of congressional hearings in October 1963, exposing him and operations to the public scrutiny for the first time. Mafia Don Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's deal maker in Las Vegas and Hollywood, was under attack on several fronts. Bobby was getting ready to run the Mafia out of Las Vegas and had gotten the FBI to put Roselli under surveillance, which it was able to do part of the time. Roselli's power flowed from Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, and Bobby had finally persuaded the FBI to go all out after Giancana. Marcello, Traficante, and Roselli had no options for survival as long as JFK was president and Bobby Kennedy was his crusading attorney general. The leading roles of Marcello, Traficante, and Roselli in JFK's murder were first revealed to us in 1992 by a top Kennedy aide, one whose personal integrity, honesty, and work for the Kennedys are confirmed by declassified files and Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. Unlike FBI and congressional investigators, this Kennedy aide knew all about the JFK Alameda coup plan and the Cuba contingency plans to protect it. Since his revelation, more than 4 million pages of assassination files have been released, confirming what this aide and 2 dozen other Kennedy associates told us about these events. Even though more than 1,000 pages about the coup plan and the Mafia's infiltration of it have been declassified, they are just a tiny fraction of the more than 1 million CIA records related to JFK's murder that will remain secret until 2017. However, information from Kennedy Associates, the most important of the 4 million pages, and the findings of government investigators and journalists allow us to show why the three Mafia chiefs killed JFK, how they did it, and some of the important people they used. While all three Mafia bosses worked together to kill JFK, Marcello was the driving force, since he had the most to lose in the shortest time. After serving several years in prison in the early 1930s, Marcello had risen through the ranks to become the Louisiana Mafia's unchallenged ruler by the 1950s. Marcello was sometimes referred to as the little man, though never to his face. His height was reportedly 5'2", up to 5'4" by elevator shoes. But what he lacked in size, he made up for in ruthlessness and raw power. Traditional mafia terminology can't convey the true measure of Marcello's power by 1963. Two of Bobby's mafia prosecutors used the term "Godfather" to describe Marcello. John Giudice, who prosecuted Marcello in New Orleans during much of November 1963, later read the transcript of the only instance in which Marcello's conversation was ever bugged during the 1960s. Since the FBI in New Orleans left Marcello alone, this single instance involved one visit to Marcello's headquarters by a very scared wired informant for the Bureau of Narcotics. The Gid described the scene to fellow mafia prosecutor Ronald Goldfarb, who wrote that the overheard conversation between Marcello and other supplicants who came to see him and seek his favors sounded like a scene from The Godfather. Diogid confirmed to us, describing Marcello as a godfather who was holding court. However, Marcello was more powerful than any traditional godfather, or even a fictional one such as Don Vito Corleone, the character in The Godfather. Even he had to share New York City with the heads of other mafia families, and the real mafia families of New York sometimes feuded as they vied for power. In contrast, Marcello reigned supreme in Louisiana and large portions of the surrounding states, including Texas, where he controlled rackets in cities like Dallas and Houston. Instead of feuding with mafia bosses in adjacent territories, Marcello became business partners with them, as he did with Flores Traficante. There was another very important difference between Marcello and almost every other mafia chief in America. As the head of America's oldest mafia family, Marcello didn't need permission from the informal National Mafia Commission to stage major hits. This made Marcello more powerful in 1963 than far more famous mob bosses who had held sway over only a particular city, such as his friend Mickey Cohen of Los Angeles and in New York's Vito Genovese, both of whom had still been subject to the commission. Unlike most other mafia families to America, the Louisiana Mafia had a long tradition of murdering government officials, beginning with the assassination of a New Orleans police chief in 1890. Marcello himself had attempted to have New Orleans Sheriff Frank Clancy assassinated in 1955 and was linked to two successful hits on much higher ranking governmental officials. The Mafia assassinations of an attorney general in 1954 and a president in 1957 had a major impact on how Marcello, Traficante, and Roselli assassinated JFK. Marcello had learned in the 1950s that by working with other mafia bosses like Traficante and Roselli, he could extend his considerable power even further. While Traficante had primary control of corrupt Phoenix City, Alabama in the 1950s, Marcello also had vice interests in the town. Across the river from sprawling Fort Benning, Georgia, Phoenix City was so lawless that even General George S. Patton had been unable to tame it. However, in 1954, an anti-corruption attorney general for the state of Alabama, Albert Patterson, was elected from the town after he pledged to run the mobsters out of Phoenix City once and for all. The mobsters faced a huge loss of revenue, so the state's new attorney general elect was assassinated in Phoenix City on June 18, 1954. However, the vice lords had been so used to the lax attitudes toward organized crime by the state of Alabama, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Eisenhower-Nixon administration that they didn't bother to use a patsy to quickly take the heat and divert attention from the real culprits. This was a serious mistake, and suspicion quickly focused on Traficante's lieutenants and a corrupt official, one of whom fled to Marcello's territory to hide, while two others went to Traficante's Florida. The brazen assassination became a national scandal, causing a barrage of media coverage. After nationwide calls for action, President Eisenhower finally declared martial rule and sent in National Guard troops to clean up the city once and for all. Though their names stayed out of the investigation, Traficante and Marcello had suffered a rare setback and would not repeat the same mistake. The error was corrected when the president of Guatemala, Castillo Armas, was assassinated in 1957, at a time when Johnny Roselli was very active in the country and Marcelo was developing his extensive ties to Guatemala and to Roselli. Guatemala's president was assassinated just 4 days after trying to close a casino owned by one of Roselli's criminal associates. A seemingly lone, apparently communist patsy was quickly blamed and soon killed. Like Oswald, the patsy was ex-military and supposedly an ardent communist who had never bothered to join the Communist Party. The investigation essentially ended with the death of the patsy, who was accepted as the sole assassin by the world press and much of the public. Both Marcello and Roselli would remember the importance of having a patsy too quickly to take the blame and divert investigators. Marcello's fellow mobsters continued to target government officials in 1963. Chicago Alderman Benjamin F. Lewis was assassinated on February 28, 1963, the back of his head shot off by 3 bullets, according to the Hoffa expert Dan Modia. He wrote that the hitman was a close friend of Jack Ruby, in addition to being an associate of Johnny Roselli. The 1961 Mafia assassination of UAW-AFL President John Kilpatrick in Chicago was an important turning point. Even though he wasn't a government official, it was the first Mafia murder solved in the city since 1934, and the first Chicago mob hit the FBI investigated, all because of new Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Guy Bannister, the FBI Chicago chief, before his drinking and erratic behavior sent him on a downward spiral that eventually found him working for Marcello, once noted in a speech that more than 1,000 gangland slayings in Chicago remained unsolved. Bannister was exaggerating only slightly, since Modia asserted that the assassination of Alderman Lewis was the 977th unsolved unworld hit in Chicago since the early 1900s. Marcello's associates were even willing to target Bobby Kennedy. As mentioned earlier, Marcello's relationship with Hoffa went back to at least September 1960, when Marcello personally gave Hoffa $500,000 for Richard Nixon's presidential campaign against J.F. Kennedy. That meeting was witnessed by Louisiana Teamster official Ed Parton, and shortly after receiving the money, the Eisenhower-Nixon administration dropped criminal charges against Hoffa. By late 1962, Parton had begun helping the government and had agreed to testify against Hoffa for Bobby Kennedy's Get Hoffa Squad, headed by Walter Sheridan. Parton told Bobby's men that in summer of 1962, Hoffa had talked about having Bobby assassinated by using a gunman equipped with a rifle with a telescopic sight, while Bobby was in the South riding in a convertible. Hoffa had talked to the informant because Hoffa believed him to be close to various figures in Carlos Marcello's syndicate organization. However, nothing happened to Bobby at that time, and Marcello may have had something to do with it. About a month after Hoffa talked about his plans to kill Bobby, two of Marcello's trusted associates introduced him to Ed Becker, an FBI informant. While at the immense Churchill Farms property, Marcello told Becker that if Bobby were assassinated, JFK would simply send in the army to get whoever was responsible. Marcello later told another companion the same thing, saying that if Bobby were shot, then JFK calls out the National Guard. Clearly, Marcello wanted to avoid another disaster like the National Guard's takeover of Phoenix City. Marcello explained that the best way to effectively end Bobby's war against the Mafia and Hoffa was to kill JFK instead. Marcello said that since LBJ disliked Bobby so much, once the president was dead, Bobby's power would be over. New information published here for the first time shows how Marcello came to his decision to kill JFK and offers the first information from FBI files tying Marcello directly to Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. These revelations provide unique insight into Marcello and his actions because they are in the words of someone who heard them directly from Marcello himself in many long talks with the Mafia chief. Marcello's confidant was a trusted FBI informant for an undercover operation targeting Marcello Chemtex for Carlos Marcello, Texas, that has never been revealed until now. The Marcello informant's credibility was confirmed to us by two former FBI agents who worked on the case, including the supervisor of the operation, Thomas A. Kimmel. The files themselves also confirmed the informant's reliability. FBI memos note that a federal judge found the informant's reporting so solid that he authorized extraordinary surveillance on Marcello while he was in prison. This included not just phone taps, but even an FBI bug in a special transistor radio for the informant, kept in a small prison cell he eventually shared with Marcello. These devices yielded hundreds of hours of tapes of Marcello, according to the files, a trove of information previously unknown to historians and journalists. Most of the following information about Marcello comes from recently declassified FBI files, discovered at the National Archives in September 2006. They covered the time when Marcello was finally serving a long prison sentence, but years before debilitating illness overtook him. These files show the informant also helped FBI offices in San Francisco and Tampa target other criminals. For example, the FBI files praised the informant for helping them target a Colombian drug fugitive, described by the DEA as the head of the Medellin drug cartel who was convicted in 1991. One of the FBI's Camtex memos says the informant's name is not to be disclosed in report or otherwise unless it has been decided definitely that he is to be a witness in trial or hearing. While some of the internal FBI memos don't use the informant's actual name, others use his real name extensively. We did not disclose his name in the first edition of Legacy of Secrets. However, in August 2009, the Camtex informant agreed to reveal his name to the public after being told about this book and the files the FBI had released. Jack Ronald Van Lanningham, now 80 years old, was surprised that any of the FBI files about his work on the Camtex undercover operation against Marcello were available at the National Archives. But since they were, he decided to speak to one of the authors as part of the Discovery Channel documentary being produced by NBC. His mind is still sharp, and he verified what he had written for the files more than 20 years earlier. All of the quotes that follow are from Van Lanningham's FBI files, in which he wrote down in the 1980s what Marcello had told him. We have made only minor corrections for grammar and spelling. Carlos Marcello and Van Lanningham were incarcerated together at Texarkana Federal Prison in 1985. They eventually became roommates in the two-man cell that afforded the mafia boss far more privacy than the large dormitory rooms that housed most inmates, even in prison. Marcello received extraordinary privileges and special treatment. Van Lanningham writes that he became pretty good friends with Marcello and that they would talk for hours about his early life in New Orleans. He told me about all the gambling clubs that he had owned in New Orleans and all over. He told me how he had got started running the mafia in Louisiana. This man had done everything at one time or another. He told me the way to make and keep money was to buy ground, meaning real estate. Marcello told Van Lanningham he owned hundreds of acres of ground that he had bought for peanuts, and now it was worth millions. Marcello's real estate holdings in Louisiana and cities like Dallas were extensive, including his 6,400-acre Churchill Farms estate outside New Orleans, once mostly swampland. After extensive parks had been drained, Marcello used its remote farmhouse for some of his most private meetings, including some prior to JFK's assassination. As a result of Van Lanningham's long talks with Marcello, he began to understand Marcello better and better. He was an uneducated Slav that had taken everything that he had by force. Anyone that got in the way of what he wanted was eliminated one way or another. He told me about the bars and liquor business in New Orleans. He never bought bars, he took them. Marcello would send men to see the owner that he wanted to do business with. The owner was told that from now on you will be selling our liquor. If the bar owner made trouble or refused, fights were staged, furniture broken up, and the guests harassed. Whores were sent in to cause trouble. The owner of the bar either went out of business or went into partnership with Marcello. Marcello had his own still in New Orleans and also shipped liquor in from Texas in 5-gallon cans. Since all of the police were on the payroll, it did no good to call them. He had them all in his pocket along with the judges. In addition to Marcello's seemingly legitimate businesses, the Mafia chief told Van Lanningham that if someone wanted to operate Vice in New Orleans, they had to go through Marcello, who made millions over the years and all tax-free. Marcello also said that in the early days he had gambling casinos, but this was stopped. Marcello had indeed controlled several lavish but illegal gambling clubs around New Orleans, until congressional hearings in the 1950s focused too much attention on them. But Marcello wasn't really out of the gambling business. As he told Van Lanningham, his Louisiana gambling operations simply went underground. The investigations of Robert Kennedy and the New Orleans Crime Commission bear this out, revealing that Marcello's gambling interests continued to gross hundreds of millions of dollars in 1963. In addition, Marcello told Van Lanningham that he was partners with a man that ran the mafia in Florida, named Traficante. They were partners in a casino in Cuba. and made millions before Castro took over and shut them down. While Santo Traficante's role in Cuban casinos was well known to law enforcement and historians, Marcelo's involvement there has always been more difficult to pin down. Since Marcelo wasn't a citizen and was in the U.S. illegally, frequent travel to Cuba would have been risky for him when re-entering the United States. But by working through Traficante, who also utilized their mutual friend Johnny Roselli to help manage casinos in Cuba, along with Jack Ruby's good friend Louis McWillie, Marcelo could reap the benefits of pre-Castro Havana without taking undue risk. Marcelo also told Van Lanningham about his first Las Vegas casino business. The Godfather said that he tried to get into gambling in Vegas by using a front man, and all was going good until the Nevada Gambling Commission learned that Carlos Marcelo was involved. They were shut down and lost a great deal of money in the venture. This statement refers to Marcelo's initial role in the Tropicana Hotel and Casino in 1957, a deal brokered by Johnny Roselli. Marcelo told Van Lanningham that he stayed clear of Vegas after that. According to a report by Van Lanningham in his FBI file, by far the most important thing that I reported to the FBI was Marcelo's hatred for the Kennedys. In the early 1960s, Robert Kennedy was after anyone involved in organized crime. He was after Marcelo and wanted him deported in the worst way. Marcelo was born in Tunisia, North Africa. Kennedy knew that he was not a citizen and played on this angle to have him deported. Marcelo had to report to INS each month in New Orleans. One time, when he reported in April 1961, he was loaded on a plane and flown to Guatemala in Central America with the help of Roselli and pilot David Ferry. Marcelo had arranged for a fake Guatemalan birth certificate. Marcelo told Van Lanningham that the governments of these countries did not want Marcelo, and he was forced to move on to another country. He spent thousands of payola to officials, but when the money ran out, he would have to move on. Finally, Marcelo was able to buy new papers in Guatemala and return to the United States through Florida. He said he hid out for a long time and moved around so he would not get caught. He finally turned himself in and was placed in a camp in Brownsville. His attorneys fought the case in court and he was allowed to stay. Marcelo was furious and vowed to get even with the Kennedys. However, the Kennedys weren't going to let Marcelo stay in the United States without a fight. Their determination resulted in the court case of Marcelo case in 1963. Before talking to Van Lanningham about JFK's assassination, Marcelo first mentioned his contacts with Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby in a casual way, while talking about his criminal operations in New Orleans. There was only one other inmate whom Marcelo felt comfortable talking to about his activities there. Van Lanningham had another friend in Texarkana prison that had worked for Marcelo's brother as a bartender. The little man would let him come to our room and they would talk about New Orleans for hours. One night, Marcelo was talking about the Kennedys. He told me and my friend about a meeting with Oswald. He had been introduced to Oswald by a man named Ferris, who was Marcelo's pilot. He said that the meeting had taken place in his brother's restaurant. He said that he thought that the Oswald was crazy. They had several meetings with Oswald before he left town. Van Lanningham said that Marcelo also told us about Jack Ruby. Marcelo had met him in Dallas, Texas. He set him up in the bar business there. He said that Ruby was a homo son of a bitch, but good to have around to report to him what was happening in town. Marcelo told us that all the police were on the tape, and as long as he kept the money flowing, they let him operate anything in Dallas that he wanted to. Ruby would come to Churchill Farms to report Marcelo, so the little man knew what was happening all the time. Eventually, Marcelo made a clear confession about JFK's assassination to Van Lanningham in front of a named witness. According to FBI files at the National Archives, Van Lanningham wrote that Marcelo was talking about his favorite subject, the Kennedys, and being deported. He flew into a rage, cussing the Kennedys, calling them every name that he could think of. I thought that he was going to have a stroke. Suddenly, Marcelo stopped talking for a minute and then continued. He said, "Yeah, I had the little son of a bitch killed, and I would do it again. He was a thorn in my side. I wish I could have done it myself." Chapter 65 will have much more about Marcelo's JFK confession, including his threat to kill Van Lanningham if he ever told, and how the FBI kept Marcelo's JFK confession secret for years. For now, it's important to note that supporting evidence from independent sources Mostly government investigators and noted historians exist for each part of the account that Marcello related to Van Leningham. For example, Marcello's admission about meeting Oswald is given credence by what the mafia boss had told another FBI informant, Joe Hauser, a few years earlier. Hauser's testimony in a government sting called BRILAB finally yielded Marcello a long prison sentence. Marcello told Joe Hauser that he and some of his men knew Oswald. I used to know his fucking family. His uncle, he worked for me. That kid worked for me too. Marcello indicated that in 1963 Oswald worked briefly as a runner for his gambling network, in which Oswald's uncle, Dutz Moret, was a longtime bookie. In the spring of 1963, Oswald had moved to New Orleans, where he lived for a time with his uncle Mert. According to Vanity Fair, Oswald's youth had been spent in New Orleans. Oswald's mother's friends included a corrupt lawyer linked to Marcello's crime operation and a man who served Marcello as bodyguard and chauffeur. In 1963 August, when Oswald was arrested after getting into a brawl with Cuban exiles while passing out pro-Castro leaflets, the man who arranged Oswald's bail was close to one of Marcello's oldest friends, Nofio Pecora, who was called 3 weeks before the assassination by Jack Ruby. FBI memos, first published in Marcello's 1989 biography, Mafia Kingfish, by John H. Davis, described Oswald's receiving money from one of Marcello's men at the Town and Country Motel's restaurant in late February or early March 1963. The nondescript motel on the airline highway, far from the tawdry glitz of the French Quarter, served as Marcello's headquarters. According to FBI memos, Oswald was sitting in the mostly empty dining room when an FBI source saw the restaurant's owner remove a wad of bills from his pocket, which he passed under the table to the man sitting at the table, whom the source identified as Oswald. Yet another well-documented link between Marcello and Oswald is David Ferrie, whom Van Leningham said introduced Oswald to Marcello. Congressional investigators, FBI reports, and even photographic evidence confirmed that Ferrie had been a leader in the teenage Oswald Civil Air Patrol Unit in 1955, shortly before the underage Oswald's first attempt to join the U.S. Marines. By 1963, former Eastern Airlines pilot Ferrie was working for Marcello and his lawyer. Ferrie was supposedly helping with Marcello's defense against the federal charges being pressed by Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department relating to Marcello's 1961 INS deportation and subsequent reentry. Both Marcello and Ferrie admitted to investigators that they spent several weekends together at Marcello's Churchill Farms estate in the weeks prior to JFK's assassination. Ferrie also admitted he flew to Guatemala twice, shortly before November 22, 1963. Based on what Marcello told him, Van Leningham accurately wrote that Ferrie was an ex-airline pilot. It seemed that he flew to Guatemala to pick up some new papers that Marcello needed to fight in the INS in a court case. Also doing work for Marcello in the summer and fall of 1963 was private detective Guy Bannister, Ferrie's associate and the former head of the Chicago FBI office. According to historian Richard Mahoney, 6 witnesses saw Oswald with Ferrie or Bannister in the summer of 1963, when Oswald garnered an unusual amount of TV, radio, and newspaper publicity for his one-man New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. 2 witnesses said Oswald was working for Bannister at that time. Marcello's admission about Ruby goes beyond anything previously reported, but is consistent with other evidence. Dallas journalist Earl Boltz was one of the first to clearly establish the connection between Ruby and Marcello's organization, a link confirmed by the 1979 House Select Committee on Assassinations report. Marcello's admission about Ruby goes beyond anything previously reported. Marcello biographer John H. Davis didn't have access to Van Leningham's information, but he was still able to detail tantalizing connections between Ruby and several Marcello associates. These included Marcello's Dallas mob lieutenants Joe Civello and Joe Campisi, the latter described as one of Ruby's closest friends and who met with Ruby the night before JFK's assassination. Davis documented that in the months and prior weeks to November 22, 1963, Ruby visited or made calls to 5 people in Marcello's organization. In addition to those five, he writes that it appears that Jack Ruby knew at least two of Carlos Marcello's brothers via slot machine and strip club businesses. Jack Ruby had worked for Chicago mobsters for years before moving to Dallas, where his duties for Marcello included being a low-level member of Marcello's part of the French Connection heroin network. In October 1963 in Chicago, shortly before the November 2nd attempt to kill JFK in that city, two witnesses saw Ruby receive $7,000 from a man who worked with Marcello's associate Jimmy Hoffa. Several witnesses say Ruby was in Houston on November 21st, 1963, apparently shadowing JFK during his visit to that city. After Ruby returned to Dallas that night and met with Marcello Lieutenant Campisi, he heard that JFK's Secret Service agents were blowing off steam at an after-hours joint in Fort Worth, so he sent several strippers from his Carousel club to join them. As for Marcello's remark that Ruby was gay, most people are unaware that Jack Ruby was homosexual or bisexual, even though such information crops up almost 40 times in Warren Commission documents, and Ruby's roommate at the time of JFK's murder described Ruby as my boyfriend. FBI files also back up Marcello's remark that all the police were on the take, allowing Marcello to operate anything in Dallas that he wanted to. The FBI interviewed witnesses who said that Ruby was well acquainted with virtually every officer of the Dallas police force and was the payoff man for the Dallas Police Department. Marcello's claim to Van Lanningham that Ruby went to his huge Churchill Farms property might explain a gap that congressional investigators discovered as they compiled detailed information about Ruby's many calls and visits to New Orleans in 1963, usually to people or places connected to Marcello. They were unable to find where Ruby stayed during his visit to New Orleans from June 5th to June 8, 1963, leading one journalist to suggest that Ruby had stayed at Churchill Farms during that time. Ruby had called the Marcello associate several times before that visit, and Ruby called the club run by one of Marcello's brothers 2 days after he returned to Dallas. By June 1963, Ruby owned a small fortune to the IRS and was facing financial ruin, which would have made him amenable to a lucrative offer from Marcello. As congressional investigators documented, in June 1963, Ruby's monthly long-distance calls built to a minor peak of more than 30, up from his usual handful. The big peak would come during the 3 weeks prior to JFK's murder, when Ruby made more than 110 long-distance calls, many to associates of Marcello, Trafficante, Roselli, and Hoffa. FBI files show that on June 22, 1963, 2 weeks after Ruby's visit to New Orleans, a horse trainer for one of Carlos Marcello's brothers said he was in a bookie joint in New Orleans, where he worked part-time. The horse trainer told the FBI that another one of Marcello's brothers came in and spoke to the owner. The trainer overheard Marcello's brother say, "The word is out to get the Kennedy family." Independent accounts support Marcello's confession that he had JFK murdered. Congressional investigators took seriously the fall 1962 incident we noted earlier, when Marcello told Ed Becker at Churchill Farms that JFK was going to be assassinated. John H. Davis uncovered a conversation that Marcello had with a close companion 6 months before JFK's assassination, in which Marcello said that to eliminate Robert Kennedy's prosecutions of him, you gotta hit the top man. This is something I gotta get some nut for, some crazy guy. But I tell you, as sure as I stand here, something awful is gonna happen to that man. That conversation occurred at Marcello's Lodge in Grand Isle, Louisiana, a popular fishing area 100 miles southwest of New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico. We found another witness who said that in early summer 1963 at Grand Isle, a cook on a large boat that Marcello used told the witness he overheard the Godfather and the mobster from Los Angeles planning an attack on JFK. What Van Lanningham said regarding Marcello's control of the New Orleans police and judges was true. According to congressional investigators and the New Orleans Crime Commission, much evidence shows that Marcello's corrupt control even affected congressmen, senators, governors, and other political leaders. Marcello told Van Lanningham about his scams with the Louisiana governor, which are described in Chapter 65. Marcello's reach also extended to federal law enforcement and intelligence activities. The JFK-Alameda coup plan gave Marcello the opportunity he needed to kill JFK in a way that would prevent even Robert Kennedy, as well as Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, from pursuing a full or public investigation of JFK's murder. Though the Kennedys had barred the Mafia from any participation in the coup plan and from reopening their Havana casino after the coup, the work of Marcello and his associates on the CIA Mafia Castro plots allowed the mob bosses to infiltrate the coup plan. While the CIA admits only that Roselli and Trafficante worked on the CIA Mafia plots, Marcello told FBI informant Joe Hauser he had been part of the operation as well. A private investigator for Marcello, Sam Bitten, was indeed working on Castro assassination plans in the fall of 1963. It's important to remember that David Morales was working on the CIA Mafia plots with Roselli at the same time. Morales had a significant role in the AM world, part of the coup plan. 12 associates of Marcello, Trafficante or Roselli, knew about the coup plan, and 7 actually worked on parts of it, including Barker and Morales. This was a remarkable achievement since we noted earlier that the JFK-Almeida coup plan was fully known to only about a dozen government officials at the time, and the first files about it weren't declassified until the 1990s. An FBI memo shows that a close associate of David Ferrie told the FBI about Ferrie's dealings with the late Attorney General Robert Kennedy and plans for a Cuban second invasion. Another FBI memo written on November 22, 1963, quotes Jack Ruby as talking about an invasion of Cuba that was being sponsored by the United States government. A long overlooked New York Times article quotes a Cuban exile who had been in contact with Oswald in New Orleans in August 1963 and who knew David Ferrie as saying that Lee H. Oswald had boasted about what he would do if the United States attempted an invasion in Cuba. Prior to JFK's assassination, a close friend of Guy Bannister wrote a description of Kennedy administration planning for Cuba, in which Castro would be the fall guy in a complete reorganization for the Cuban regime, which will then be free of Soviet influence. After Castro's removal, Bannister's friend accurately noted that a new government for Cuba would be set up with such men as Manolo Rey. These are just a few of the associates of Marcello, Trafficante, and Roselli who knew about the JFK-Almeida coup plan. More are documented in the next chapter and other parts of the book. One Marcello associate named John Martino not only boasted to journalists about his knowledge of the coup plan, but even taunted FBI agents with his inside information. So many of Marcello's men knew about the JFK-Almeida plan, and that it's inconceivable Marcello didn't know about it too. By November 1963, Carlos Marcello was confident that he could get away with assassinating the President of the United States because he made sure that JFK's murder couldn't be fully or publicly investigated without exposing the coup plan. As documented earlier, even the bullets in Oswald's rifle could have led investigators to the plan with Almeida. Knowledge of the coup plan enabled Marcello and his associates to compromise each of Bobby and Harry's exile groups in some way. The Mafia chiefs used money to essentially bribe our time in Verona, while they compromised Reyes and Minoyo's groups by linking them to Oswald. As for Harry Williams, Marcello left him to his friend Trafficante. On one occasion, former Death Squad leader Rolando Masfera confronted Harry at Bobby Kennedy's New York apartment. As we noted previously, the CIA associate of E. Howard Hunt took Harry to an impromptu meeting with Trafficante, who fruitlessly offered Harry a bribe. Still later, on a trip to Guatemala to meet our time, Harry was attacked by 2 gunmen in a restaurant, and he barely escaped after shooting one of them. The CIA ties of Guy Bannister and David Ferrie, documented in Chapter 6, using new information from the CIA deputy chief in New Orleans, also enabled Marcello to take advantage of U.S. intelligence operations for his own ends. Memos show that the CIA almost recruited Bannister in the summer of 1960 when the CIA Mafia Castro assassination plots with Trafficante and Roselli began. Guy Bannister's secretary says that Roselli visited their office in the summer of 1963 while the CIA Mafia plots continued. Bannister also had ties to naval intelligence through his close friend Guy Johnson. In addition, Bannister had also served in the FBI on a major case with General Joseph Carroll, JFK's trusted head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which included naval intelligence. Several years before JFK's assassination, Bannister had even been business partners with Carmine Bellino, a close advisor to JFK, who was part of Bobby's Get Hoffa squad in 1963. In short, Bannister had numerous ways to feed disinformation into various agencies. As for David Ferrie Anthony Summers writes that the former executive assistant to the deputy director of the CIA confirmed that Ferry had been a contract agent to the agency CIA in the early 60s in some of the Cuban activities, and Richard Ham stated that David Ferry was a CIA agent in the fall of 1963. In the summer of 1963, Manuel Artime briefly had a training camp near New Orleans, and Summers writes that Guy Bannister's secretary said that Ferry not only met Oswald, but tipped him on at least one visit to the anti-Castro guerrilla training camp outside New Orleans. A CIA note card about Lee Harvey Oswald, declassified in the mid 1900s, said there had been no secret, as far as anyone was concerned, in regard to the fact that Bannister, David William Ferry, and subject Oswald may have known or been acquainted with one another. Given all those connections, when Oswald talked to Marcello in the meeting, Van Lanningham described, the young man may have thought he was being brought into the CIA mafia plots by Marcello and his associates. Marcello faced losing his empire, his freedom, and the ability to stay in America unless he ended Bobby Kennedy's extraordinary power by killing JFK. In November 1963, when Marcello was being tried on federal charges that Bobby had brought against him, even a minor conviction could have resulted in his deportation. Marcello had already found a way to evade justice by bribing a key juror. However, he knew that a new investigation would begin as soon as that trial was over, and Bobby did later prosecute him for bribing the juror. Bobby was already focusing on tax charges against Marcello, the same technique used to send Al Capone to prison, and the mafia chief knew he would have no respite while JFK was alive. Doing nothing about JFK and Bobby simply was not an option for Marcello. He knew that JFK Almeida coup plan was perhaps the only thing so sensitive that it could trigger a cover-up by high-ranking U.S. officials, just as the Kennedys felt they had to stage their coup with U.S. officials. Just as the Kennedys felt they had to stage their coup with Almeida soon, Marcello knew he had to act before the coup took place and removed his only opportunity to force a cover-up by officials like Bobby Kennedy. Marcello had nothing to gain and everything to lose by allowing the JFK Almeida coup plan to go forward. As long as JFK was president, Cuba would not be a safe haven for Marcello or any other mafia boss. Hence, Marcello had to kill JFK before December 1st, 1963, the scheduled day for the coup. That's why Marcello organized three attempts to kill JFK during November 1963 in Chicago, Tampa, and Dallas. Marcello relied on his trusted associates to help him, the Chicago mobs Roselli and Trafficante in Tampa. The men sometimes met at a secluded resort outside Tampa, the Safety Harbor Spa, whose exclusive clientele and distinctive staff freed the mob bosses from any possibility of law enforcement surveillance. Trafficante also met with Marcello in New Orleans once or twice a year, and we noted earlier Roselli's trip to New Orleans in 1963. In the JFK hit, these mafia chiefs were only doing on a larger scale what they had done successfully in the past, and using only associates they knew they could trust. To be continued.